Elin is a textile artist and a dyer, and from 1992 to 96, she was ProChem's lab manager. She's a chemist. So, not a chemist.
I'm not a chemist.
Never mind. But in addition to that, she has the award-winning book, Dyes and Paints, a hands-on guide to coloring fabric. And she's exhibited her beautiful artwork all over the world, including the Schweinfurth Art Center, where she had really large-scale pieces on display before my time, which I still, ogle over the catalog that was produced, which I have in the house, by the way. So I'm excited to hear about this project with the apple trees, and she's going to tell us all about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for leaving your studio. I know it's a hard day to kind of leave because tomorrow is the last day and there's a lot to get accomplished in the studio. So, and thank you, my class, for coming because I know you have a lot that you're working on. So what I'm going to talk about today is a collaboration that my husband and I have been working on, and we're still working on. It started in 2018 at a residency that we had in Denmark for a month. And we didn't exactly know what we were going to do when we got there. We just knew we wanted to work with some sort of dye plant that we found there in Denmark. And so I'm going to walk you through our residency, kind of how we approached, how it unfolded, how we approached the dye process, how we approached the design process, and some of the work that has come out of it, as well as some of the work that is continuing. We're exhibiting this work next year, 2025, in Denmark, in the town that supported our residency, with more work than what we have right now. So the title of the exhibition that has been traveling now is The Apple Tree on the Abandoned Railroad Line. So it came about by being on the island of Funen, which is the middle of Denmark. Denmark is this tiny country sandwiched between Sweden to the east, Norway to the north, Germany to the south, and the peninsula that comes up from Germany. And the island that Copenhagen is called Sjælland or Zealand, which is to the right, and Fyn is in the middle. That's where Hans Christian Andersen is from, is Odense. I always say Odense. But Assens is the town that gave us our residency. They were our supporting figures. And this is the port city of Assens. It's a small little town. It's called a commune, and that is the village or the area of Assens. They do a lot of tall ship festivals there as well. Usually about every 2 or 3 years they come through. You can see one there in the picture. It had just finished. It lives there. It had just finished going somewhere else. Where we were housed was an old sawmill. It was a third-generation sawmill. I guess he's actually an industrial designer and furniture maker now, but his grandfather started the sawmill. It's on a small stream, which is what propelled the sawmill. And that still works today. It hasn't been dismantled. That's still how he saws planks, or on this water-driven sawmill. And this is the house that his grandfather lived in, his grandparents lived in, is on the left-hand side. That's where Lasse and I had our place. He grew up in the middle, and then he built the house on the right, which he lives in now. This is his grandparents' old house. This is what we had around us, including an old scale, which I used to measure things on. It was this counterbalance scale that was almost rusty, but not quite. There was a lot of charm in this place. Everything worked. The other side, as we walked out of the house, we looked across, and that's where there was the furniture designer worked, and to the left-hand side was our studio. It's the upper edge, that upper spot. You can see there's skylights there. That's actually what, most of our light was from those skylights. The light otherwise was not particularly terrific, but we worked mostly during the day anyway. Here's the steps leading up. The neighbor had chickens, which were kind of running around the stairs usually there every time. You could find eggs flipping around the property quite regularly. And that's inside the studio. Initially, we were dyeing with burdock root. We dug burdock and we were dyeing with the root and some of the leaves, and we were not particularly I knew they would give us more browns, and I was hoping I could shift them a little bit more than I did, and so we weren't particularly satisfied with the palette, so we decided we would go a little bit further, and we learned about this abandoned railroad line the second week that we were there on the island. And the abandoned railroad line was about 25 miles long, and it started in Assens, and it went to this other little town called Tomarup, which was a little bit further from where we were staying. And here you can see old railroad cars, and this is Narup, which was the town that we were closest to, and we could walk here from our little house. It was a very easy walk, maybe a 5-minute walk to get to the railroad line. And it's now used as a walking path, and it's used as a bicycle. They have bicycles on railroad track cars. So you can pedal bicycles, there's 2 bicycles on each car, and you can pedal the cars and it goes down the old railroad tracks. It never got very far because they decided that they put the gauge of the railroad was not the rest of the country. So it was only for this little 25-mile stretch. But it ran from 1906 to 1996. And here's a photograph from 1996, and you can see that there's no trees above those railroad cars. It was totally open, but it transported people between these towns, this 25-mile stretch, which was about halfway across the island. And that was to work or to visit family or to see friends, that type of thing. And the one thing that Fun is known for is growing apples, kind of like this area is growing a lot of apples. So what people would do is they would take the train, eat an apple, pitch it out the window. And they found after the railroad stopped working, or the train stopped going in 1996, ever since then, apple trees have been growing. They have found about 130 apple trees along this abandoned railroad. And they are figuring out if some of them are good enough to eat or some of them aren't. There were some very tasty apples on this abandoned railroad line. And then I happened to find one that was super, super, super astringent. So that's Lasse. We were taking a walk down the railroad line. I also knew that I could find a lot of yellow dye in the leaves of fruit trees. So we decided we would see what apple trees we could find along the railroad line, which we did. You can see it's very filled in. A train would never fit through there anymore. It would knock them all down. But a lot of these are actually apple trees. So here I found this apple tree that was super astringent. It was about 50 feet tall. It was massive. It was very healthy. And this was September. I took a bite of it and I could have sworn that I was sucking on a tea bag. And about 2 hours later, I thought I still had that tea bag in my mouth. So I thought, okay, this is good. It will give me my tannins, which is a component of natural dyes. It will give you beautiful grays and blacks. So I thought, okay, we'll dye with the fruit, we'll dye with the leaves, and we'll dye with the bark. So we collected some, brought it back to the apartment, and we cooked it up. So here you can see how abundant the apples are. It was and not a particularly, again, good apple. But we did have a lot of good apples we ate there. I didn't worry about stripping the tree of the leaves or even branches, in part because there were so many apples, and also because it wasn't really an edible apple tree. A lot of the apples were pretty high, so I picked them up from the ground. Also, there was a lot of nettles around, so I tried not to get into the nettles too much. So once we got back, I cut up the leaves, put them in one pot to boil up, and put the fruit in another. And the fruit, whenever I was using the fruit, the house smelled like applesauce. It was quite lovely. The leaves would make it smell a little bit more herbal. I was cutting them up here because I thought I needed to cut them up to get as much dye out of them as possible. I very quickly learned I didn't need to cut the leaves because this took an extensive amount of time. What I did, though, was find out very quickly is the flavonoid, which is the yellow color, is very sensitive to heat. So I would heat these dye baths up to maybe about 110 degrees for about 15 minutes, and I'd scoop the leaves out. And I would end up getting this brilliant yellow dye. And then I'd put the leaves back in and I'd keep cooking them, and then these rustier colors would come out, more the tannins would come out of the leaves, and I would get a whole different palette. Here I'm actually straining some apples, and I will keep using these strained apples, strained leaves, strained pieces of bark and leaves, again and again and again, 3 or 4 times, to be able to build this shade range of silk and cotton fabric. And ramie, I didn't dye any wool, I dyed ramie, hemp, linen. So on the left-hand side, that pot is filled with the apple tannin. It's kind of a rosy color, or clear. It doesn't have a lot of color, but the pot on the right-hand side is filled with the flavonoid from the apple leaves themselves. So in August and September, there's still a lot of this dye component in the leaves. Early in the year, there's very little, and as the leaves start to turn, there's also very little. So there's this window where you can actually harvest things and get a lot of dye out of them. Here you can see that the leaves themselves, I didn't cut them up anymore, and that silk organza that I would strain them in, and you can see that the color of that silk organza is starting to turn orangey as well. And that's because the leaves that have the stems will also start imparting these tannins that I keep talking about, which is like tea. It gives it a browner color, so it gives that yellow, that bright yellow, it gives it a little more brownness. The yellow bag is filled with leaves, the brown bag is filled with apples, and they're just kind of waiting for their next infusion. So we were there for a month in 2012. And we were dyeing fabric for about 3 weeks. I had brought about 20 yards. And then we realized when we got home that we needed a lot more fabric. So we went back in 2019. Here's the wall of I'm gonna interrupt myself for a moment. This is the wall of our studio as the fabric started growing. You can see there's this huge range of yellows that I got. And I wasn't trying to match it. So each 2-yard piece that I dyed was a different shade of yellow or orange or kind of this rosy color. What's on the left was dyed with apples. What's on the right was dyed with the apple leaves and some of the bark where it starts to get very orangey. All of this cloth has been treated in alum first, which is a mordant, which is needed for natural dyes. And a mordant is something that is between the cloth and the dye. So ultimately, the dye could care less that you want the color on the cloth. It doesn't care, but it loves a mordant, which is a metal. In this case, it's aluminum, which is a bright colored metal. And the aluminum likes the cloth. So the aluminum becomes a bridge between cloth and dye. And if you don't have the aluminum, you don't get any dye on the cloth. These guys this week have been learning this.
How color fast are these dyes?
So the question is, how color fast are the dyes? They are going to be just about as color fast as synthetic dyes, as dyes will be. There are dyes in the natural dye range that are not very color fast. I choose ones that have good color fastness, so that they don't fade. That is an importance. So we took walks every day also, besides the abandoned railroad line. There was a lot of fields around us. And this is a rotting fruit, a rotting apple. And I think it's absolutely beautiful, this graphic design that happened, that nature is giving this piece of fruit as it decays. We also found that just things in nature, things in the landscape, we would bring in and we'd put on the windowsill, we would make collections. They're all giving us inspiration for just what is around us, what are we looking at, what are we observing. This was the field right out in front of the house. And in Denmark, they do a lot of fields with trees, not big, massive fields that we have here in the US, but they put tree breaks through them quite regularly, and they're for a couple reasons. One is to have pollinators, and the other is a place for the birds to be. And the big companies have been buying up a lot of land, and they've been trying to take the trees down, and the local administrations won't let them take the trees down because they feel it's way too important to the habitat for the whole island, for everybody. It also breaks the wind because Denmark is super flat, and the wind just kind of comes barreling through. So of all these pieces of cloth, these about 30 yards that I had of cloth, I do this all the time in all of my work, and I've done it for years, and that is to make test strips, to find out what do I have, what will it give me, what are my parameters, where can I go with this? So I had a lot of silk organza, and I cut little finger-sized pieces of silk organza and wanted to modify the color. So I modified the color in different strengths of iron. This is iron that you use in the garden. And on the right are different strengths of iron solution, and on the left are pieces of silk organza that have been dipped in the varying strengths of iron, so that I can see what will it give me. The two pieces on the bottom are dyed from the apples themselves. You can see there's this beautiful dove gray and going into black. And it would go through green, brown, and many varying shades. As you probably well know now, the left is dyed in apples, and the right is dyed with the right is dyed in apples, and the left is dyed with the leaves. So these are some bigger test strips that I did on cotton of things dyed, the cloth dyed in apples, the cloth dyed in leaves. The piece right above it, these test strips became very, very important, not just for giving us information, but we ultimately decided that we were going to base the artwork that we did for this, for the whole series on a test strip. So this is the first piece that we did, where we ripped pieces of the silk organza and dipped it in the iron solution to see what different colors we would get, and then overlapped some of them in the middle and stitched them all together. This became this was our first piece, and this is not ironed. We have since now started ironing them, but we found that that was super important to have this, in a way it becomes a color chart. It becomes this color history of what has come from the apple tree. They were also really interested in filming us, so a TV crew from Copenhagen actually came out to film us for the Danish TV about these people that were there dying from an apple tree, which was pretty fun. And this is Lasse, my husband. When we got home, we started ripping up the pieces of cloth into larger, we just enlarged this whole test strip idea, and started dipping them into the iron, different strengths of iron. This is our studio in New Bedford before we moved to Washington State during COVID. And Lasse has done all the dipping on these pieces. And here they are drying. The color range is really profound. So we did take ourselves back to Denmark in 2019, in the summer, in August that year. And I had mordanted 300 yards of between silk organza, a ramie, a cotton, a cheesecloth, and a couple of other types of cloth. And they were all mordanted before we left. So when we got there, we spent 3 weeks as little dying fiends, a little production dyeing of cloth through this apple tree. I had pinned it on my phone so we could get back to the tree, which was kind of fun. But the lovely thing about dipping this in iron is look at how elusive the color starts to become. And as a lot of you know when you use silk organza, is that you can layer things and one color becomes, two colors become a third or fourth color, and in surprising colors. Some of these pieces that we ended up doing are 6 layers of organza because of their luminosity. So organza can frequently be used where you can just use it to look through it and to see different things through it. And in this case, we found that the work became much stronger by having them against a wall and just being illuminated, and their luminosity shot back at us, which was a wonderful surprise. So the piece on the right is the first one we were working on after we did that little small piece. And the one on the left was one of the second ones that we did of this large scale. What we did, you can see that they're kind of wrinkled. This is when we determined that we really needed to start ironing these pieces because the luminosity of organza didn't show up when they were wrinkly. So we had to take some of them apart and iron them and put them back together. So the piece on the right looked a little bit like the piece on the left, and we thought it was static. And so we cut it up and re-pieced it back together. And here's Lasse. We designed these together. I do all the stitching, he did the dipping and iron, but we do the design work truly collaboratively. And Lasse, my husband's an art historian and also an artist, now retired art historian. So here you can see in his hand he's holding up their lengths of silk organza that are different colors. And we're layering them behind these pieces to give luminosity through them so that they become different colors. And so we're testing out, does it work to have this dark or this light behind here? This brightness, this darkness, you know, what happens when we shift the shade behind our pieced front piece? This is ultimately what this one looks like. This one is titled Schweinfurth, which is named after the man who invited us to be at this residency. And here I am. This is also our old studio in New Bedford. And you can see some pieces are on the back wall, and I'm stitching another piece together. There's the threads. I have lots of different colors of yellows and grays and browns and even blacks to be able to stitch, because I would change the stitching color as I moved across the piece. I didn't dye this thread, but if you see on the back wall on the left-hand side, those are all, it's Masterpiece by Superior. And there's, my long arm is right there, and I've dyed most of those threads that I used on the long arm. I was not able to find threads that I liked for the quilting I was doing, but I did not dye these threads. I didn't need to do that. I found them. And here you can see that not only am I matching, I will change thread color with each shift of color of silk organza, and that's because I didn't want the threads to be important. They're just there logistically to hold the piece together. I also love to collect rocks. So here are some of my favorites. Here are just some of the flattest ones that I use as weights. This is, in the beginning, this is some of the first pieces. This is their first layer, their top layer, before we started building the back layers. So you can see we methodically went through and dipped the edges of our test strip, either a little bit or a lot, both sides or one side, and then methodically went through and put them together as these test strip pieces. This is some Korean silk organza. It's a very heavy, not a spun silk, but a carded, and it's a spun silk, a carded and spun silk. It's a very kind of lumpy silk. I have some samples of it up here. And this particular, the pieces I made with this heavy Korean silk are garments. I made two garments. I made a jacket and I made a top. And here I am figuring out the sequence of this silk being stitched together in a bojagi style, but by a sewing machine. So I had some bojagi influence in some of this. Here's the back of the top. And it does split like that so that it does open and comes around, and the front was straight and the back goes around and angles up on either side. So our first exhibition was in '22 in Massachusetts. This is one of those pieces. It has, in fact, I think this piece right here, the piece on the left-hand side, when it had its other areas, the background added to it, this is what it turned out to be. Behind it on one side is a very dark brown piece of silk organza, and on the other side it's been dipped in titanium, which turned it bright orange. So there's a different luminosity, and colors that came out were lavender, light blue, pink, oranges, grays, various browns, a whole palette that I was not expecting at all. It was a wonderful surprise. So here's the jacket and that top you saw hanging. This is how they hung in the exhibition. This is some more of the work in the exhibition. We did 2 different sizes with the silk organza. We did one that's quite large. It's about 85 inches by 55, and these others are about 45 by 30, or 22, 45 by 22. The pieces on the left are using a cotton, Korean cotton gauzy stuff, gauzy-like fabric. And I ripped those up and then dipped them in either titanium or iron to give them the feel of an ikat almost.
That's beautiful.
And then hand-picked and stitched them so that, again, I wanted them to feel as though they were floating in space, not where you can see how they're attached, but they just were there. I also did some work with a heavy cotton gauze, not gauze, but I don't know, kind of a muslin, but a little more gauzy-like, and distressed cheesecloth on the top. This is again the exhibition in Fall River in Massachusetts. Last summer it was in the Netherlands at High Five Art Gallery for 2 months, and here is, you can see again some of the work. Whoops. It was fun to see this in different locations. I think that's true with all work, is that different locations, different venues, different lighting, different ceiling heights, they all make things feel different. You feel different in the space, you feel different surrounded by whatever it is you're surrounded by. And this work looked especially beautiful here. And we ended up selling 6 of the pieces, which is why we have to make more work for next summer. We were not expecting that. We thought, oh, we'll just put high prices on them so nobody will buy them.
Should have been higher.
So the piece, the piece on the left, that smaller piece, there's no dipping of iron on that piece. It is purely, all those colors came out of just these different shades of yellow. I'm in awe of this. I was not expecting all this, I really wasn't. I put this slide in there because I wanted you to see the back of this piece as well. This is also hand-stitched. Again, I don't want the stitching to be part of this issue. I want it to be as though things are just floating in space. Last November, I showed this work, some of this work and other work in a gallery in Washington State in Mount Vernon. I did these 3 panels. This is the very heavy silk organza from Korea. The black one is all done by dipping in the iron. It's all from the apples themselves, so it has that tan, and it was that lighter rose color or almost clear color. The one on the right is an example of things being dipped in iron or titanium and just the apples themselves, and the one in the very back is just the apple leaves. So these panels are about 9.5 feet tall. And because of the configuration of the gallery, their walls, and I couldn't put any nails in the walls, I ended up doing a series of 8 by 10 frames and 9 by 12 frames. So I made versions of some of the work smaller to be able to fit into a frame. And then that lined the gallery wall. In fact, you can see some of them there on the right-hand side, and you can see them here lining the gallery. It was a really beautiful space, and it felt very nice. It was fun to get people's reactions walking in the space, because they walked in and they would, there was a bench set up right in the middle of some of these pieces, and so people would just go in and sit, which was really lovely. Really lovely. So here's that same that I showed you from the Fall River that's much larger. I made them on a much smaller scale. So the squares are even half the size of what they were before. And again, I've stitched them, I've just kind of pick stitched them together, and they were then mounted on foam core that was smaller than they were and floated in a frame. So they just float in the space on the frame. Here's some of that cotton with the distressed cotton cheesecloth. And I've also been getting into bojagi, hand stitching. So when we travel, which my husband and I have been doing a bit, I've been taking just my scraps of, these are all naturally dyed pieces of cloth, and needle and thread, and then stitching them together. So these are quite small. They're not real big pieces, they're quite small. But I'm having a blast doing this hand stitching. It's very satisfying. Here's my design wall as I was building the work, figuring out what was going to go in the exhibition. So the pieces on the right look very irregular, and that's because I hadn't figured out the framed size yet. They hadn't been cut down quite yet. And here I am stitching some of them, mostly from the back. I'd stitch from the back. And this is what some of that yellow dye looks like with the apple leaves. And so it was really twofold what we decided, not initially, but once we were there and we found this apple tree, we realized there was two things that we were very focused on. One was that we wanted a minimal vocabulary, visual vocabulary, and we chose the test strip. And yes, we kept wanting to diverge from that, but we kept coming back to the test strip, this idea of dipping and having a test strip. And that was what we are still holding ourselves to, because we want this to be a harmonious series. We want this something that even if we're using lots of different cloth and have it put together in some different formats, it still is going to read well together. So we wanted it to be, this test strip was our chosen thing. And then the other was the apple tree. Everything that we got from the apple tree. And it was a surprise to us, and we love it. And we're really happy to be showing it in Assens. And I still have some fabric left, so that we will be building more. Not so much silk organza, so we don't know where it's going to go yet. We'll figure it out.